You may be seated. After happily accepting Pastor Luz Marina's invitation to preach in her stead this morning, of course my first question was, what are the readings? Well, that question was rapidly followed by, how do you spell how do you pronounce Habakkuk? 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 Habakkuk. Well, when I was a student at San Francisco Theological Seminary in California, I had the great privilege of studying the prophets of the Hebrew Bible and under the tutelage of the doctors Robert Coote and Marvin Cheney. Engaged by their enthusiasm and of these two wonderful scholars, I gained a special love and respect for the books of the prophets and the ancient Hebrew world. But I can say that Habakkuk stands out in my memory. Since I didn't get a confident response to my question about pronunciation until I found Ashley. Is Ashley here today? Ashley was at the retreat, and Ashley was the first one that said with confidence, Habakkuk. So I'm pronouncing it Ashley's way this morning. But knowing that it was hard to find the pronunciation, I dare to presume that perhaps this is not a prophet that is known to many of us in this congregation. This book comes to us from the last quarter of the 7th century before Christ, or before the Common Era. By this time, the confident days of the strong, united nation of Israel were long past. Our writer speaks to us from the southern kingdom of Judah. This remnant of the once powerful united kingdom of Israel, this lineage of David, was also nearing its end. Like many powerful nations and rulers before and after Judah, Judah was beginning to crumble from within due to greed and abuse of power by its ruling class. It is in this context that we hear the prophet's lament to his God. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? The prophet's grief for his nation and his people is wrenching. His anguish over what he fears to be God's silence is profound. He yearns for justice and sees it not. Yet in the second part of the first chapter of Habakkuk, which was not included in our reading this morning, Yahweh has a hard response to the prophet's lament. God replies to Habakkuk, saying, I am rousing the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous nation. Their horsemen come from far away. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence. They gather captives like sand. Yahweh's words to Habakkuk foretell of the prophet's nation being overrun, defeated, dragged off into captivity in Babylon, a reality which came to fruition just a few decades after the writing of this book. How was our prophet to understand this response of God? Surely he knew the Psalms. He believed the psalmist's assurance. Trust in the Lord and do good, so you will live in the land and enjoy security. Commit your way to the Lord. He will make your vindication shine like the light, and the justice of your cause like noonday. The message seems clear. Be obedient to God, and God will give you your land and will make you secure there. It's interesting that Habakkuk's name means to embrace or to wrestle. In this book, the prophet is indeed wrestling with the difficult question: how was he to make sense of God's promise as told in the Psalms, when his country of Judah was dissolving under the weight of greed and abuse of power, and when his people were soon going to be overrun and taken off into captivity. How many times have different peoples asked similar questions over the past 2,500 years? Don't we hear this question echo today in the agony of the Holy Land? What is God's promise to the people of Palestine, all the people of Palestine, all the people of these holy lands? Where is justice in the promise? Habakkuk wrestles with the question of God's promise. If God's promise is not a guarantee that we will live in peace and prosperity, what does it mean to believe in God? Habakkuk comes to the conclusion that the promise lies in obedience to God, regardless of any reward. In the closing verses of the book, the prophet declares, "Though the fig tree does not blossom and no fruit is on the vine, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength." Our Christian beliefs lead us beyond this obedience. Our Christian beliefs teach us that God's promise is relational. Through the Christ, the entire world is being reconciled to God. The assertion that I will be your God and you will be my people is inclusive, not exclusive. An inclusive promise to all the people. Habakkuk's lament is met with the promise of obedience to Yahweh. But the gospel offers us a greater opportunity. Not just obedience, but the remarkable experience of the faith encounter. This is the tiny, explosive, dynamic faith that can expand and grow like the mustard seed. It is the dynamic, relational encounter between the believer and God. It calls us into an interdependent community of believers. This tiny but powerful mustard seed faith grows best in the soil, water, and sunlight of our relationship with God and with one another, our faith community. But does this faith experience then remove our yearning for justice? Far, far from it. Like the people in the Babylonian captivity, like the Palestinians and Israelis in the Holy Land today, our faith experience compels us to be a justice-yearning people. What is the justice that you yearn for? For whom do you yearn it? For yourself? Perhaps for a family member or a friend? Do you yearn for justice for a country, for a region, for a particular people, for our entire world? Being a justice-yearning people doesn't guarantee that we will all define justice the same way at any particular moment or response to any particular situation. In fact, our faith in our Creator reminds us always that we are not the final judges. That horrible responsibility is mercifully lifted from our shoulders by our eternally loving, forgiving, and embracing God. But this very God calls us to be like Habakkuk, to be wrestlers with the responsibilities of the requirements of God's justice teachings, embracers of Christ's call to stand on the side of the poor, the oppressed, the dispossessed. The prophets, the Psalms, the Gospels, the New Testament letters, all repeatedly remind us that God's people of faith must act for justice as best we know how. While the thousands of years old history of our faith communities remind us that we often fall short of that vision of justice. What then sustains us? It is our confidence in the unshakable presence of our loving God. This is the God we are able to experience through our fragile yet firm faith. Each one of us is a small mustard seed trying each day to live out our love for our Lord and our world as best we know how. Together, we are a vibrant, rich field of mustard that bears wonderful witness to God's love for each person, every community, and the whole of creation. Thanks be to God for calling us into both this particular faith-filled community of Geneva and to the worldwide ecumenical community of faith. Amen. Please stand.